We are very happy that we have a young panelist, Blessy, who's also read the book. We welcome her. And to chair the session and to moderate the proceedings, we have our distinguished colleague, Venkatesham, who's Principal Secretary to the Government of Telangana. So welcome, Venkatesh. And it's a nice Sunday afternoon in Hyderabad, and we look forward to the discussions. Thank you very much.
A warm good morning to everybody, those who are watching online and also those who are in the hall and my co-panelists. It's a privilege to chair a session like this where people from across the country are watching and listening to good literary works, either translated or written by themselves or talked upon on various aspects of the literature. It's very, very nice to be part of such an exercise. And we are happy that our stalwarts in the service, they are doing this work, especially Sanjeev sir and also Ajay Mishra sir. They were in our training days, we know them, they were our course coordinators. So from that day till today, they are doing something or the other which continues to keep their spirits high and keep us motivated. So today's book is Ratna Dholi, Best Stories of Dhumketu, translations from Gujarati by Bhatt. So if you see the book per se, it's a translation by Bhatt of great literary short stories by Dhumketu. So Dhumketu is the pen name of a great poet called Gauri Shankar Joshi ji. But the way he depicted the short stories with such craftsmanship, such great skill, it looks as if it is happening before you. It's not a story that you are seeing or you are visualizing, you are viewing as if it is happening before you. So when things will happen to you in that way, the 5 elements are matching. One is the content and the context. Third is the intent and the writer and the reader. If these 5 people are 5 things, 3 things and 2 people are in the same mood, then it gets elevated into a reality. So the content is so forceful and the context in which he wrote these stories is also so wonderful. And the intent is not to show his literary skills nor to showcase his choice of words. It's always to put the content into the right perspective than to showcase the greatness or the poetical skills of the writer. So the intention is really meshed into so much blended into the content, so they become almost same. Then the writer never wanted, as I told of his intent, he never wanted to dominate the scene. There are many writers I have read, they want to dominate the scene. Everybody should know this is written by such and such writer. From starting the word to the ending word, you will never miss that what is the story. You may miss the story, you may miss the purpose of it, but you will never miss who wrote it. So then the writer is dominating there. But in this case, writer is not dominating. Added to that, the reader, whoever chooses to read such this thing, unless and until that person is in some other bad mood or some other context is happening to him at that, to her or that point of time, they are choosing, they are opting to read this. So the reader and the writer are in the same plane, and the content is so forceful, context is so well defined, intent is meshed into all these things. and added to that from an unknown language to many of us. Jaya Bhattji, so she brought it in such a way that it is as if it is originally written in English itself. So it's not that it is we are reading something from Gujarati to English. The choice of words, the way the translator chose is as if it is happening directly before us. So such a good combination has happened. So I'm very happy that whether you read Post Office or The Necklace or Ratna Dholi or any story in that context, in that perspective, they merge into so beautifully. So I'm very, very happy and proud to be part of this, but without, because we have very less time. So the writer, the translator is here, and Professor Nikhila is here, and the young colleague, Ms. Blessy, is also here. So they will also be explaining, unless until otherwise, if I have any chance to interlude, I will not be interluding. So I request. So I think Jayaji can okay. Then Nikhila ji can explain, then Jenny, but Madam can come in wherever she feels so.
Thank you very much, sir, for beginning this session on the right note. I thank the organizers for asking me, first of all, to be a part of this Valley of Words, but also for giving me the opportunity to read such a wonderful collection of stories. I might have missed it if it was not for this particular occasion. Thanks to the translator, Jenny, for this really very well put together short story collection. I read this over the last 10 days, so the stories are pretty fresh in my memory. So as Venkatesham, Mr. Venkatesham pointed out, this short story collection is collection of stories written by Gauri Shankar Govardhan Ram Joshi, better known in the literary world as Dhumketu. And it's translated into English by Jenny Bhatt. And the title, as we all know, is Ratna Dholi, who is one of the eponymous heroes of the short stories in this collection. The collection was published in 2020 by Harper Perennials, which is an imprint of HarperCollins. The collection has about 26 wonderful and very vivid pen pictures of many common people, people whom you may otherwise miss, when you pass by, and you may know nothing about them or their remarkable talents, or the pain and burdens that they carry. So you can really see that the subject of literature here is shifting from the good and the great to the flawed and the common people who are now the new subjects of this short story. As someone outside the Gujarati literary culture, getting acquainted with Dhumketu in English, I can think of him in terms of his Kannada contemporary Masti Venkatesha Iyengar, who was also, like Dhumketu, one of the earliest short story writers who perfected the form of the short story in Kannada. Dhumketu, like Masti, not only seems to have introduced new themes and subjects through the short story, but also, like him, experimented with narrative form, and also, I think, made it into a modern genre. And also experimented with perspective. I found many of these narratives very fascinating in terms of the introduction of the narrator and the narrator's point of view, and the way in which it colors the entire short story. For instance, in a story like A Memorable Day, which juxtaposes the stories of two namesakes, I think we learn so much about the narrator himself as much as we learn about the two Kamalas and the worlds they inhabit. Till the end, when we discover, along with the narrator, that the two women have the same name, we think that we are actually reading two different stories, and we think this narrator is kind of intervening and giving his point of view about two very different women. But through that narration, we also find, we also get to know who the narrator is, what his values are, whom he privileges, whom he compares and contrasts. The eye of the narrator, which sees art in the commonplace, embellishes the character of the second Kamala, vis-a-vis the first one, who is kind of the unfortunate one. The collection paints, I think, on a very vast canvas, some very memorable characters, exceptionally talented but grieving musicians like the Shehnai player, whose story the narrator hears in Hassan. Again, very interesting, the location of the short story, and Jenny Bhatt in her introduction very usefully tells us how Dhumketu is a much traveled man. So I'm from Karnataka. I was surprised to see Hassan figuring in a short story, in a Gujarati short story. Then the story of the dhol player, of course, Ratna Dholi. But Dhumketu's pen does not spare pretenders like the wannabe poet Raskalanand, very interestingly named again, or Manmohan, whom, I mean, there is a touch of sympathy there, I think, also reflection on, is he good enough? And obviously, when he knows that he's not good enough, why does he persist? So this whole exercise of pretending to be a writer and having found his vocation in writing and persisting with it at great personal cost, all mediated through, again, the eyes of the narrator, really puts, one into a kind of a thinking mode. I was also intrigued by the kind of dystopian atmosphere created by one of the short stories, The Rebirth of Poetry. Again, has very many contemporary echoes, this story and many others as well. And as Jenny mentions in the introduction, I think there are some very memorable female characters too in the short stories. The noble daughters-in-law, for instance, and the unlikely bond between, two very different kinds of women, and probably women of different ages. Also, the cruelty of Naveen. I mean, it's a chilling short story. The cruelty of Naveen, who kind of instigates the other people, who come to the hostel against the woman in the short story when Devi Ma becomes a woman. I understand it's based on Gorky's story, but again, the way in which I think the writer recontextualizes it is wonderful. We were talking in the beginning about the Queen of Nepal. Again, one of those stories that show Dhumketu's wanderings to the northeast. I have a few questions for Jenny, so maybe I can begin by asking Jenny some of the things that struck me while reading the story. From what I saw in the dedication of the translation to your mother, This translation project seems to have a very personal and familial connect to Dhumketu's works. How important is it for a translator to like, the author that one is translating, particularly in the case of literary, pieces, where often the initiative to translate comes from the translator. I'm, of course, assuming here that you decided to translate Dhumketu. So how important is that, a kind of a personal investment and connect with the author as it happens in this case? Over to you, Jenny.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Venkatesham. Thank you, Nikhila ji. And thank you, Value of Words, for this event. I'll get straight to your answer. And thank you, by the way, for a great introduction. I do believe that that a translator must have some connection with the work or the author that they are translating. It doesn't always have to be a liking or it doesn't have to be that, oh, I like these stories and therefore, there were some stories in here that I didn't particularly enjoy, but I thought they were significant in Dhumketu's body of work enough to be translated. For me, as you rightly said, it started out because Dhumketu was my mother's favorite writer. She loved short stories. She studied Gujarati literature, and she couldn't finish university or college because she got married, and so she was a reader most of her life. And so certainly we heard some of the stories growing up from her. And then when she passed away, I inherited her small personal library, and she had every single book of Dhumketu's. And so for me, it was more, even more than feeling connected with Dhumketu. To be quite honest, this whole translation journey of these stories that I did was a way for me to reconnect with my mother. Even more so, I don't believe that I would have, even as much as I did enjoy Dhumketu's stories, I don't think I would have chosen to make the multi-year commitment that it takes to put forth a book-length work of translation, had it not been, in my case, that way for me to connect with a mother who had suddenly passed away. And it was my way of reconnecting with her and staying connected with her. And so for me, it was a very personal thing. And I remember even as I was translating, there would be bits of language or dialect in the story that would remind me of something that my mother would have said. And I would immediately WhatsApp my family and I would say, do you remember mommy saying something like this? And so, I'm not saying that this is how it should be for every translator. For example, I've heard Arunav Sinha, who everybody knows, he translates from Bengali to English and now even the other way. And he's talked a lot of times about how sometimes he's not in sympathy with the work that he's translating, but parts of it, or maybe even the writer necessarily, he doesn't agree because maybe it's, ideas of their time. And yet he thinks the work is important enough as part of the literary canon. So he's doing the work. So in his case, he's obviously done, so many translations, and he doesn't feel the need to be connected. With me, this was my very first book-length work. And so for me, it was important to have that emotional and intellectual connection. And then I'll add one other thing that, I started out as a short story writer myself. My very first book was a short story collection. And so I've always been interested in the short story form. And going back to the Gujarati pioneer of the short story, Dhumketu, was a way of me acknowledging our literary ancestors, our literary traditions. Because although I write in English and I write, stories contemporary of our time, I'm not writing stories about the times that Dhumketu wrote about, but I still acknowledge the tradition that we've inherited because we all grew up listening to oral storytelling. And so whether we know it consciously or not, we've inherited all of this. And so doing this translation was also, for me, a way of paying it back, of acknowledging that debt that we have to writers like him.
Thank you. Now, Blessy, if you can.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny ma'am. It's indeed a privilege for me to be a part of this Valley of Words. Jenny ma'am, I would like to ask you one question. That is, a majority of the stories from this book, Ratna Dholi, are set in rural Gujarati, and a number of them are set in India's northeast. So how are you able to understand the culture of these regions? Because I feel that it's not just translation. You require something beyond that, like a deep understanding of the culture. So how are you able to do this?
Yeah, I mean, for me, so I was born and raised in India. I grew up as a, in a Gujarati family. I grew up reading the language. I grew up reading Gujarati magazines that my mother used to have. We didn't have a lot of books around the house other than my mother's Gujarati books and Gujarati magazines. And obviously, we would travel back to Gujarat. Although I was in Bombay, we would travel to Gujarat because that's where my parents were born and raised, and so we still had a home there. And so we would travel to Gujarat for holidays, for functions, festivals, you know. So I've always stayed connected with Gujarat in that way, and I've always read Gujarati. I still have bookshelves full of Gujarati books. So I've stayed connected. Now, the Northeast was different for me because I've obviously not been there. Thankfully, I will say that Dhumketu also wrote a lot of travel memoirs, travelogues of all the places that he went to. And so there was stuff about the Northeast in particular that I was able to go back to his own memoirs, and particularly his memoirs called Jeevan Panth and Jeevan Rang. Those two are about his own journey and evolution as a writer. And he talked about in those two books his influences, which were both influences of other writers, as well as influences of settings and places that deeply moved him to want to write about them, like the Northeast, like Karnataka. So I had access to some of his personal writing, and that helped. And then, as I said, beyond that, it was mostly my own. I actually translated all of Ratna Dholi while I was living in Ahmedabad. So in 2014, I had moved back to India for another writing project. And I lived there from 2014 till just before the global pandemic started. And so I was actually physically in Gujarat, immersed in the culture, talking the dialect. And because Dhumketu was originally from Ahmedabad himself. And I met his family there. And so it was a way of me reconnecting, if you like, with Dhumketu and with Ahmedabad and with the milieu that he inhabited when he wrote those stories.
What I found very useful in the book is the outwork for the book. For instance, the translator's introduction is very, very informative. The glossary, of course. So I felt that any translator in today's context, I think, has to keep in mind the potential readership, for the book. So it's not just about translating the literary text, but also providing this kind of a necessary outwork and contextualization that is so essential. So I want to address a couple of issues, that you have raised there in the introduction. The first is about the evaluation of the importance and stature of writers who get translated into English. You mentioned that if Dhumketu would have been translated more widely into English, he would be seen as, as important as a Chekhov or a Tagore or a Premchand. Do you want to say something about this route or approach to Indian languages, route meaning the path, this route or path to Indian language writers via English, this tendency to notice writers who only come into English first, and then we go back to read them in the Indian languages. Do you want to say something about that?
Sure. Yeah. Dhumketu, for example, I mean, he wrote 26 volumes of short stories. There were about 600 plus short stories that I read every single one because I wanted to make sure I was picking not necessarily the best ones, but the ones that I thought really represented his oeuvre and his, range. So that was important. Now, to your question about how we discover writers through the English and then we go back to them. Well, I mean, unfortunately, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we don't have a lot of people who read bilingually, who read in, who are English readers, but they also read in other languages. I did it because of my mother, quite frankly, because that's what she read. She was not a reader of English. She read in Gujarati, and those were the books lying around my house. And so that's what I read. If you were a reader, those were the books I had access to. But of course, nowadays, I think it's very different now. Almost all our media, whether it's news media or social media, is all in the English language. And there's nothing, I mean, I write in English myself, right? So, I mean, it's not that there's anything wrong. I think English is very much an Indian language. The colonists left it with us and we've made it our own. So I don't have a problem with English. And I'm quite happy that people may be going back and reading Dhumketu in the original Gujarati because they first discovered Dhumketu in the English. I'm very happy when I hear somebody say, "Oh, I need to go and now read all of his Gujarati, the stuff in Gujarati, because that's going to be so much richer and so much more potent." But it is a shame, and I think what you're speaking to is really a larger problem, which is that growing up, we don't have access, or we are not told about this treasure trove of literature that exists in regional languages. Unfortunately, this has a lot to do with institutional curricula. And I studied in India. I went to high school in India. I studied till the age of 18. So I know that I did not have visibility to a lot of the translated works or writers that I got to know through translation. So that's one thing. I think it has a lot to do with how, what our institutions emphasize. I mean, I studied Dickens and Eliot, and Tolstoy when I should have been reading Dhumketu and Premchand and, the other writers even in Indira Goswami, from the Assamese. So we should have been reading those writers. But there we are. Now, the good thing is that we're able to, through, venues like Value of Words, like you said, you would not have known of this book had it not been for Value of Words. I've discovered a whole bunch of translations because of them. So I think we're in a place now as a society where we can, if we look carefully, have the visibility and awareness of these works in the regional languages. I just heard, for example, JCB, the richest prize in Indian literature, they just announced, and it was a translated work, right? A Malayalam to English translation. So I just think, more power to all of these folks that we're finally getting to read some of these, and I've always said some of the best literature coming out of India and South Asia is not written in English. It's written in the regional languages. And so I'm glad that more people are now paying attention. Publishers are now paying attention to these works.
Jenny ma'am, thank you very much for giving that perspective. But as you have already translated Dhumketu's short stories into this beautiful volume called Ratna Dholi, so can you also try to translate, because you have now, because of your mother's influence or because of your connection with Gujarati and English literature together. So can you do something what he wrote as travel stories which he traveled, Dhumketu's travels memoirs, if you can put them into translation? Because why I'm
Yeah, I would
particularly
love to.
no, why I'm particularly asking this is I was Secretary Tourism and Sanjeev Chopra sir was also Secretary, Principal Secretary and Chief Special
Oh,
Additional Chief Secretary Tourism. So the travel memoirs, how much they influence, particularly if they're coming from a person who writes the actuals, not either exaggerating them or trying to put into his perspective. So like Dhumketu's
yes.
say post office, there's never any visibility or indication that writer is influencing the story. Probably he has written exactly as what he saw without his coloring his perception. So Northeast, as we
Yes.
see today, is have lots of confusions, lots of issues. So that mainstreaming of Northeast is very important to us today. So what he saw at that point of time in 1920s till today we are in 2020s. So about 100 years, how it is changing, how it has got changed. So if we can see them in that perspective, so that will be very helpful. As we are already in your introduction to the translation, you have clearly given the visibility which gives the subject more value. For example, say Premchand or Tagore, because their visibility was much higher when compared to
Yes.
Dhumketu or Gorky or some other English literature giants, though they may not be of higher value when compared to Dhumketu or Venkatesham Iyengar or our own Gurjada Appara or somebody in any other regional language, because they are not visible to people outside, so their importance is not known to the world. Though we call them as regional languages, they are essentially global languages. Because,
Correct.
say, Telugu, for example, being spoken by almost like 15 million people or some more than that in some places in one city like Hyderabad. For example, now it is spoken by almost like 15 million, 150 million people across the world. So still we
Yeah.
call it as a regional language. No, it's not a regional language. It's a global language
True.
when compared to Norwegian or Dutch language or some other language. So somewhere we need to put this into perspective, at least as a cross-cultural bridge or cross-language bridge, like Valley of Words is
Yeah.
doing this great work. So if we can have English being now more or less English, to some extent Spanish, to some languages, if we can have this kind of translations as a practice, probably people will know, okay, though they may not understand the context 100%, but they will appreciate the literary value in it.
Yes.
So
I
the
mean, that's what
follow,
I say. You know, a
yeah,
book like
yeah, please go
this,
ahead.
it's not just a collection of stories. It is it is a historical artifact. It's a cultural artifact. These books, these classics, are artifacts. You know, they are treasures that we need to make sure that are preserved and are carried forward, and not forgotten. So yeah, I totally agree.
Uh, think of writing, translating the travel memoirs of
The
Dhumketu,
travel,
it'll
yes.
be it'll be very good. So because I have written some books myself. My book was called Selfie of Success. It became comparatively well received, almost like about a lakh of copies were sold on various platforms like Amazon and then in regular shops also. But I know how difficult it is for the people to publish books. It's not that value of the book is less. Something is not getting published doesn't mean that it has no literary value. It only means that
Right.
it is the author or that piece of work has not reached the proper person, or it has no commercial value. That's all. So commercial value in many times, as you see, will not go hand in hand with literary value. So
Rare.
commercial
Yes.
value is more with dramatics, trying to impress somebody than to portray the reality. So somewhere value of words and people like you who live in both America and India and Bombay and Ahmedabad, so happening places. So if a platform can be thought of where
Yes.
people can apply, okay, this is what I wrote. Can you think of doing it widespread circulation? Maybe kind of publication
Right.
or by introduction of that subject somewhere. So this kind of work, because Dhumketu was unknown person to me till a week back. Today, now I
Yeah.
know him so much, just because of
Mhm.
value of words or because of your translation. Otherwise, who is Dhumketu? He's like a fog or
Right.
a fume, like Dhum in Telugu we understand as the fume. So it's gone.
Right.
Somewhere it got lost when he died. But today,
Mhm.
we came to know about him. Now we understand his capability of writing is such a forceful manner. So somewhere if we
Yeah.
can put a platform where people can put their writings to this platform, where at least they need not be publicized as because they may not have commercial value or the monetary issues may come into the play, but if they can be
Yeah.
preserved and kept
Yes.
whenever somebody has to research into it or access to it, so properly showcased, properly cataloged, if that can be done, that will be wonderful, ma'am. So you can
Yeah.
throw your
Yeah. That's a
perspective.
great
Yeah.
idea. Hmm. Yeah. No, I mean that's a great idea. Yeah. Sorry.
Ma'am, this is your first literary translation from Gujarati to English. So, yeah, to translate something foreign, what aspects, you may call it as skills or whether it's aspects, like if you prioritize, then what are the most important things that you require to translate something foreign?
Hmm. Well, I think first thing I would say for translation is the skill of close reading. And when we read any book, we're reading to find out what the story is. We're reading to escape or for entertainment or to be informed or educated. But when you're translating, you really have to do a very slow, close reading of the text because you're questioning every word choice, every phrase choice. You're not just reading to understand, you're reading because you want to get very into the language itself, the dialect language. So I would say the skill of close reading is number one. And I think the second is a lot of people think, well, how good is your Gujarati? And I say, well, my Gujarati is, good enough because I speak it at home and I speak it, I write it, I read it. But when you're translating from a source language into a target language, I think your skill in the target language has to be good. Because at the end of the day, when you're reading the source language, you're understanding it. Yes, you need to understand the nuance of the word in the source language, but then you have to find the best possible translation or translated word in the target language. So that's the second thing. And then I would say the third thing, if it's fiction, like I have translated, is you need to have some understanding of the craft elements of fiction. So you can understand, okay, well, in this story, Dhumketu has chosen this point of view, and this is how they've described, they've focused on the setting, or this is how they have chosen to give us the character arc. And so having some understanding of the craft elements of fiction so that you understand from a craft standpoint what the writer did. And the reason I say that is so that you don't lose that. If the writer has created certain subtext, certain microtensions, certain conflicts within the story, you want to make sure those things do get carried over in the other story. You don't want to lose some of that subtext wherever, as much as you can. You don't want to lose those micro tensions and the conflicts. So I think understanding the craft of fiction certainly can help when you're translating fiction. So I would say those would be my top three: close reading, being good in the target language and understanding, if it's fictional translation, understanding the fiction, craft of fiction.
In spite of the fact that these stories were written like probably over 60 or 70 or more probably years ago, you mentioned that, there are people, for instance, with strong and independent-minded women and sensitive men. And indeed, I think that's what speaks to a modern day reader as well, right? Was that too, I mean, I was just wondering, was that too a criteria, one of the criteria for your selection, that these particular stories, that figure in this collection were chosen precisely for the kind of characters that they delineate? In other words, how important is it for a translator to be acquainted with the contemporary literary milieu in English while translating an old author? One, of course, is, as you said, the target language. But I'm also asking about the larger literary milieu and what will work in that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And to be honest, because I'm a writer myself, because I'm also a short story writer, certainly as I was reading Dhumketu's many stories, there were some stories that I was drawn to more because of my own contemporary and literary sensibilities. And so, yeah, I mean, I would say there's certainly a personal bias towards those stories. But also, yes, you're absolutely right. I think knowing, because at the end of the day, you have to think about a reader. If you're looking to publish this book and you hope that there will be readers, well, even before readers, you're hoping that a publisher will consider your project a viable commercial project. So for the publisher to even feel that, yes, these translated stories will sell, therefore I will take the project on, you do have to appeal to certain contemporary literary sensibilities. I completely, agree with that. That it turned out that many of Dhumketu's stories, almost all the ones that I read, 600 some, all had this sort of timeless, modern, forward-thinking sensibility, was one of the luckiest things. I didn't know, I wasn't expecting it. I mean, I'd heard some stories from my mom, and again, she also gravitated towards the strong women, being a woman herself. But I hadn't read all 600 stories, right? And so when I took the proposal to the publisher, I had given them a sample of 3 translated stories. I had picked 3 stories with 3 very different kinds of narrators, just to give an idea of range. So one was the Queen of Nepal at the time, I remember. One was Kailash, and the other one was On the Banks of the River Saryu, which was about a child. And so I picked 3. One was an old man protagonist or point of view, one was the woman, the Queen of Nepal, strong woman, and one was a child. And so I wanted to show that range. So those were the 3 I gave. But again, they're timeless. They could be written now. Those stories could have been written by a writer today. I could have written them. Except, of course, I'm not Dhumketu, which means that the whole way that he gives the dialect and the way he unfolds the story is very different from how I would have done it. But it was beautiful being immersed in his stories and in his words and just learning from him,
Yeah, ma'am, if you see the short stories, though Post Office is among all the stories you have chosen to translate, the Post Office is much more widely known.
Yes.
Whereas the book title is Ratna Dholi. So Ratna Dholi is also, I read it, so beautifully portrayed. But since the women are writing a lot these days, and they are also reading a lot these days, and their participation into day-to-day activities other than household has increased a lot. But if you see the story of the named Ratna Dholi, the cover title. In that story, again, if you see, though the lady Sundari has no fault of her, but she has to go maximum pain, even those days and even now. Though for anything, whether good or bad, the maximum punishment or maximum harassment falls upon the lady, though she has nothing wrong on her side. So,
Yeah.
what do you think of this issue, and which story you like the most among all the stories you translated in this book?
Yeah, I mean the issues around how women are treated in society. You're absolutely right. If we had that same couple in once, I'm sorry, that's my dog. Shh. If we had that same couple today in Gujarat somewhere, you're absolutely right. The woman would still be the one outcast from society, and it's a sad thing that it's almost 100 years since he wrote that story, and we still have that. I don't know what. Yeah, it's a sad thing. Coming to your second question about my favorite story, that's a tough one because it changes every time I reread or revisit these stories. Of course, my approach or my decision changes. I will say that right now my favorite is the Shehnai player story, Svarjogi, and the reason is we're just getting ready in the next few months to bring out the US version of Ratna Dholi. So there's a publisher in the US who will also be publishing it. So thankfully, as you were saying, Mr. Venkatesham, there will be now readers in the US who will get to read and know who Dhumketu is, even if they may not know Gujarati. And for the US edition, we have chosen the title, The Shehnai Virtuoso. For the main reason that Ratna Dholi is, for US readers, they may not know they may not even know how to pronounce it. But the Shehnai Virtuoso, as in Swarjogi, is something that they will be able to understand. And we got a beautiful cover that the designer, the cover designer is the same person who designed the Ratna Dholi cover. And so he's designed it, and I just shared it with a lot of people. And that story suddenly has become very important to me now because it is the title story of the US edition. So I would say that's my current favorite, the one that is set in Hassan, Karnataka. Yes.
Okay. Um, okay. While talking of your own act of translation, you mentioned that translation is about transformation of something foreign into something familiar. Um, uh, can you just explain that a little further? What do you mean by translating something that is foreign into something familiar? So what was foreign and what is familiar over here? Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, obviously, I do have familiarity with the language, but what was foreign to me was these stories are set in a milieu that is not mine. It's not the one that I grew up with. They're set in a time well before me. A lot of them are set in rural India when I grew up in urban India. And so for me, those were aspects that were foreign. Even the language, quite frankly, Gujarati has so many dialects. And the dialect that I grew up speaking, which is a version of, Kathiawadi dialect. And so the Kathiawadi dialect, and while Dhumketu does use that for some characters, but his dialect, the Gujarati dialect in his stories are very different. And so I think to me, the dialect part, and I also think to some extent, I wanted to, when I read these stories to translate them, when you're doing that kind of close reading, while you're immersing yourself in the language, you are seeing things in the story that you would not have seen otherwise. So in a way, for me, it was as if I was coming to this world that Dhumketu had created, the world that he had built in each of these stories, as if they were entirely new and foreign to me, because that got me interested in how I was going to, that kept me on my toes for translating it into English, which is obviously a very familiar language to me because I write in it and I studied it and I went to school and read everything in it. So to me, that's what I mean by the foreign, because it is foreign in terms of cultural, even though I am Gujarati myself, but it is foreign to me because it was written in a different time, about a different group of people. So yeah.
Okay, thank you, Jenny ma'am. So this is a wonderful opportunity for us to meet you, though online, and
Yes.
co-panelist Professor Nikhila ji and young colleague Ms. Messi. And I thank a lot Value of Words, Sanjeev Chopra sir. So thank you very much, Jenny ma'am, for this wonderful opportunity to meeting you, though online. So we would be meeting you sometime online to offline directly meeting you. And then our co-panelist, Professor Nikhila ji, and also Ms. Blasey, and especially I thank for this opportunity Sanjeev Chopra sir for this value of words, and Ajay Misra sir bringing all of us together for this wonderful session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.